So we just discussed what assumptions are. We discussed the explicit assumptions that are directly stated in the passage, and implicit assumptions that are not directly stated, something we can infer, imply, or take for granted sometimes. We also discussed that there are certain assumptions. There are types of factual, analytical, and moral assumptions. The factual assumptions that are facts that we probably know and we don't want to prove them again or talk about them or justifies them somehow, such as the Earth is round. And the second one is analytical assumption. That one is more complex. Imagine that we and it's specifically maybe done by a lot of scientists. So when we make a research, we usually obtain some information. For example, we can conduct a series of interviews and then make certain evaluations, interpretations, conclusions, and those are analytical assumptions. Sometimes they are, could be in different nature, such as like inductive and deductive nature. I'm pretty sure you know that inductive is from specific to general, and deductive method is from general to specific. Those could be already analytical assumptions. So for example, deduction. We say that all humans are mortal, or let's do it differently. All birds have wings. So that's probably an assumption. And that's an interesting assumption to make, very general, analytical, but then we try to say that everything that has wings is a bird. It's certainly not sufficient. So sometimes the assumptions we make can be faulty, not because we intend to confuse somebody, or we just might make some wrong assumptions when we make research. And even when we're trying to be objective, we might fall into the trap of assumptions. So when we interpret something, evaluate something, we might make certain assumptions. It could be because of the type of research we make, or because we want to prove certain point and we want it to be correct, and therefore we might assume a lot of things that are not there. But like I said before, and I think it's very important to mention that assumptions are not always bad. Assumptions often save us a lot of time. So if imagine we had no assumptions and we had to prove every single point, if we didn't share any knowledge, if we didn't have any common knowledge, we would have to prove everything from scratch, and assumptions certainly to save us time. Plus we have a lot of shared assumptions. If we come from one culture, one let's say occupation, that all creates a whole new set of shared assumptions. What about values? Those are very interesting. Other assumptions deal with values. Unlike factual and analytical assumptions, which can be defended with evidence and reason, it's almost impossible to prove values. Either you share them or you don't. One of the sample article implicit assumptions about value of poor people or people of color should not experience unfair impact simply because their socioeconomic status. This assumption depends on ideas. What is fair? That is very difficult, if not impossible, to defend with evidence and reason. This does not mean they're wrong, just you're unlikely to convince anyone of them through logical argument. So, values. So we all have our values, we all have our belief system, and that would depend on how we were brought up, what we believe in, and of course it would often depend on the religion. So whatever we believe is good or bad could be different from culture to culture, religion to other religion, but there are, of course, some people would argue that there are universal values, that there are certain values we don't need to translate in other languages, everybody understand them. But it's so different, for example, what people understand as fair. What is fair, especially what is fair to, I don't know, animals, like how we should treat them. And is it moral to eat animals? And there are a lot of issues like that that are very controversial. And the arguments would depend on the morals that we have and the way we were taught, shaped, the way we were brought up. You can make your argument stronger by using good premises. Once you have good reason to believe are both true and relevant to the issue at hand. So remember what our evidence are? Premises are evidences, or it's reasons or evidence that is supporting your conclusion. And remember, we discussed the indicators. Sometimes we say because, since, for the reason, and so on and so forth. Those are when we hear the indicator of premises. And good arguments usually have good premises. They're usually true and relevant. So relevant means they're on the topic. So when we try to prove something, we don't cite something different or something that's not relevant or something that's emotional. We try to appeal to logic, and they're true. Hopefully you don't provide anything that's not true or fake. It's not verified. That's very important. Therefore, when you prove your point, you try not to use facts that are not supported or articles that are not verified. So you have to make a good deal of work to prove that, to work on that. Making sure your premise provides good support for your conclusion and not some other conclusion or no conclusion at all. So, of course, we want to support our conclusion, and we don't want to support another conclusion, and that's not actually stated. We want to be on the topic, and we want to have solid premises to support our conclusion. Checking that you have addressed the most important and relevant aspect of the issue. That is, that your premise and conclusion focus on what is really important to the issue. And that's maybe a very difficult thing to do, because sometimes to certain issues, there are so many aspects, and addressing one aspect and not addressing another is certainly not going to make your argument strong. And therefore, sometimes in the arguments, the author provide not just evidence to support it, but sometimes address the opposite side or providing concessions. The next one, not making claims that are so strong or sweeping that you can't really support them. And I think that's important for writing essays, especially, or making research in general, that you don't sound too absolute. So avoiding absolute language, such as most, all, always. And when we make a research, we try to be objective, and therefore we usually use terms such as certain, some. In many cases, it is likely. We don't try to generalize and say that, for example, if I conduct a research and I ask questions, conduct a poll, or I can conduct an interview among 10 teachers, I cannot really claim that it is true for all teachers in the world. It's only 10 people in a certain environment, and I cannot make this kind of sweeping generalization. So we have to be really careful about that. The final part is a fallacy. That's a very important topic, and that's what makes the argument bad, right? We all can fall into the traps of fallacies, but what is important for us, is not just to identify fallacies when we hear somebody's speech or when we read an article and see that. It's important that we avoid them in our own writing. So when we write an essay or when we provide certain arguments, we try to think if there are some fallacies or there's something that could be wrong with it. So fallacies are defects that weakens the arguments, right? By learning to look for them on others' writing, you can strengthen your ability to evaluate the argument you make, read and hear. So that's what critical thinking is, right? When you're a critical thinker, you can identify the fallacies, you can find the assumptions, and that's what makes you more a critical reader and thinker in general. And I think that's very important both for learning and teaching. When we are learners, we try to filter all the arguments and information that's coming to us, because there's so much information and there's so many fake news, there's so many wrong or arguments that are created to, to confuse you. So identifying fallacies and thinking about assumptions helps to be objective, or to try to be more or less objective. Because we're all human beings and we make mistakes, and that's okay. It is important to realize two things about fallacies. First, fallacious arguments are very, very common and can be quite persuasive, at least a casual reader or a listener. So when we see them, sometimes we don't notice them because they seem very convincing. And it could be because we like the person or because we like the argument, we believe in that. And that's why it might be very persuasive, but we have to check the argument, even if that's our friend, or even if that's what we really believe in and that's the idea that we like. We have to check it. You find dozens of examples of fallacious reasoning in newspaper, advertisement, and other sources. So yes, we find them everywhere. Second, it's sometimes hard to evaluate whether the argument is fallacious. An argument might be weak, somewhat strong, or very strong. An argument has several stages or parts, might have some strong sections and some weak ones. As we discussed before, arguments consist of different parts and they can have several premises. Sometimes arguments are not just like 100 words. It could be an article, a full article. And therefore we need to be really careful of what exactly is the argument and are the premises relevant, and if they're not relevant, how? Okay, let's see the first one, I think, and the biggest one is a hasty generalization. I know, probably most of you know generalization. So remember, as I said before, when we have a little set of data and we try to generalize it, like I ask 10 teachers for their opinion about technologies, and I say that's what all teachers think about, which I cannot say. I cannot even say if I ask 10 teachers in one university, I cannot really say that all teachers in the university think so. Or even if I ask all teachers in the university, I cannot really say it's true for all teachers in Kazakhstan. So those are hasty generalizations. But let's see the examples and discuss it on a very specific basis. Hasty generalizations.